much for the very generous introduction. Thank you all for making time in your very, very busy schedules to be here. As life goes on, I am more and more moved that anyone comes to anyone's lecture ever. So anyway, thank you. I should say in advance, I'm not really going to answer my question, how to describe an atrocity. So don't ask a clever question at the end and say, you have not answered your own question, sir. I know. This is the beginning of work on what to me is a very important subject, but a very difficult one. So I give you something in its preliminary stages. One more thing before I start. If you don't understand me, I would prefer if you would make some kind of physical sign. Okay? I mean, it could be, anything, as long as I don't say things that you don't understand, and then I will feel very stupid afterwards. Okay? So and now you nod to indicate in a physical sign that you understand. Thank you. Okay. I use the word atrocity to signify an act of cruelty judged to be extreme or outrageous because it's collective, unnecessary, and/or indiscriminate. Used in this sense, the word is as historically relative as the word literature is. As I'm sure everyone knows, the word literature did not always refer to what it refers to now, creative, imaginative, fictional writing, as distinguished from truthful description or exposition. The norm of truthful writing had to come into existence first in order for literature to be contrasted with it. In the same way, certain norms had to be put in place in order for the word atrocity to acquire its present meaning, or perhaps the norms and the perceived violation of the norms came into existence at the same time. The word atrocity comes from the Latin for cruel or terrible. In everyday usage, it's often used as a rough equivalent to massacre, as in Jacques Semelin's book, Purify and Destroy, the political uses of massacre and genocide, a form of action that is most often collective and aimed at destroying non-combatants. Thank you. Massacre comes from an old French term for slaughterhouse, which is to say a place for the butchery of animals, and it means unnecessary and indiscriminate butchery of people, with a suggestion that this is transferring to people a kind of killing that's familiar to humans from their treatment of animals. History has now brought into question the implicit norm in this case, that is, the acceptability of the industrial scale butchery of animals. And it's worth noting that the word cruel itself was not initially pejorative, whether in Latin or in English. The meaning of the normal or the ordinary had to change in order for atrocities to come into existence as acts of cruelty that go beyond the ordinary. So, the description of atrocities is not a traditional task of literature, and could not have been a traditional task of literature. But I think it has become a task of literature. Many novels have taken upon themselves this task. As everyone knows, the significance of the novel has been challenged in recent years by the rise of more popular cultural forms, electronic and digital ones especially. Some critics, like Jonathan Arrak, have proclaimed that the great age of the novel is over, and it may be. But one claim to contemporary significance that novelists around the world continue to put forward is the claim to be able to deal with acts of atrocity that seem somehow definitive for their societies. Whether definitive because they were suffered by their societies, or definitive in some cases because they were committed by their societies. Committed, that is, by their fellow countrymen against the citizens of other countries. I'm thinking, for example, of Leo Tolstoy's novella Haji Murat, which describes the destruction of an indigenous village in the Caucasus in what we would now call Chechnya during the 19th century Russian conquests of the East. I see people are following. Good, good. That will make things easier. That Tolstoy himself participated in as a young man. You can follow, but from time to time I will depart from your text, as is my right as the speaker. That Tolstoy himself participated in as a young man, and that so neatly mirror the genocide of the Native Americans that my countrymen were carrying out in the same years in the American West. Tolstoy could not get that book published in his country during his lifetime. It is an amazing fact that he left this record at all. I'm unfortunately ignorant of East Asian literature, but I asked the specialist and was told that there's at least one Japanese novel exposing the slaughter of Chinese civilians during the Japanese invasion of China, Ishikawa Tatuzo's Soldiers Alive. Does anybody know this book? That's interesting. You would think that it would be popular in Korea. Came out in serial form within months of the 1936 rape of Nanjing. Ishikawa was arrested and tried and convicted, but then released and allowed to return to China on condition that he never write anything like that again. And he didn't. I have the fantasy of trying to create a counter-history of such moments of national self-critique, that is Tolstoy and Ishikawa, however badly the stories may end. And I would be very grateful to anyone who might want to email me with suggestions about other texts I might look at, or thoughts about the project as such, whether this comparative post-colonial turn might be an unpromising direction for post-colonial studies, or an unfair test of national literatures, or whatever. In any case, I'm interested in the representation of what is perceived as atrocity. I assume that the category is subjective, that an atrocity is what is perceived as an atrocity. And I'm interested in the question of how novelists have done it and why, and what difference it makes. That is, the ethical and political issues involved. So I give you some examples. The first sentence of Camilla Shamsi's novel Burnt Shadows goes like this: later, the one who survives will remember that day as gray. But on the morning of 9 August itself, both the man from Berlin, Konrad Weiss, and the schoolteacher, Hiroko Tanaka, step out of their houses and notice the perfect blueness of the sky into which white smoke blooms from the chimneys of the munitions factories. This would be a good sentence to spend some time analyzing. Shamsi borrows here from the famous first sentence of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. Can I just ask, how many people here have read 100 Years of Solitude? Should be required reading, but many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. I force my students to memorize this sentence. I think it's one of the great first sentences in modern literature, actually, and you can see how similar Shamsi's sentence is to Garcia Marquez's sentence. Both of these first sentences use the figure of analeptic prolepsis. Analeptic prolepsis, a flash forward in time, that's the prolepsis, many years later, accompanied by a flash backward to remembrance, was to remember, that's analepsis. it turns out that a number of other contemporary novelists have used the same figure of analeptic prolepsis, or at least the prolepsis part, and have done so in order to refer to an atrocity. So here I depart from your text just for a second to say, I noticed this pattern and I'm trying to understand it. I haven't understood it yet. Okay, but it seems to me interesting simply to notice the pattern, to collect the examples, and then to try to think. So that's what I'm doing. The 9th of August, to which Camilla Shamsi is referring, you probably know this, is the day in 1945 when the atom bomb, the second atom bomb, was dropped on Nagasaki. This makes one realize that Shamsi is very quietly trying to achieve a certain balance in her sentence. The cloud of smoke from the munitions factories that ends the sentence is a premonition of the much larger mushroom cloud that is shortly to destroy the city. But it's also a reminder, if it matters, that this peaceful city is manufacturing munitions, that's armaments, hence is part of a war effort, hence in the eyes of some is not distinguishable from the war's actual battlefields. The sentence contains, in other words, the elements of a genuine conversation about the ethics of dropping the atom bomb. This is remarkable, given that, as the novel goes on to show, Shamsi herself is very clear that this was indeed an atrocity and does not in fact go very far into the conversation. But I think her first sentence gets credit for asking some question about this. To hear later the one who survives, in the context of the dropping of the atom bomb, is to realize one function of prolepsis. It guarantees that someone is going to survive in order to tell the story and reflect on its meaning. This seems to me a first reason why prolepsis tends to cluster around large, life-threatening episodes like the bombing of Nagasaki, or like the massacre of the striking United Fruit Workers in 100 Years of Solitude, which you really should go out and read. Many years later, that's the signature effect, many years later, that child would still tell, in spite of people thinking that he was a crazy old man, how Jose Arcadio II had lifted him over his head and hauled him almost in the air as if floating on the terror of the crowd toward a nearby street. So this is while the crowd is being machine gunned by the army, which actually did happen. Or, I don't know if people know this, the Amritsar massacre of 1919 in Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. I'm going to ask the embarrassing question again. How many people have read Midnight's Children? No comment. The machine guns, again, this is a historical fact, the British massacre of peaceful demonstrators in the city of Amritsar in 1919. The machine guns have begun to fire. The hero's grandfather has escaped the bullets by accident, only by sneezing and falling down. And we get this prolepsis. The clasp of his bag is digging into his chest, inflicting upon it a bruise so severe and mysterious that it will not fade until after his death years later. So that's the prolepsis, the jump forward in time. Years later, on the hill of Sankarya Acharya or Takht-e-Suleiman. The announcement of his death years later is of course a way of saying that the grandfather does not die here and now, as we have every reason to fear that he will die. And it's worth saying that the two locations given for his later death, you see how strange that is? Two different names. One of them Hindu and the other Muslim, separated by an or. This is a reminder that the conflict between the British and the Indians that seems at the moment of the massacre the only meaningful conflict that anyone has to pay any attention to was in fact never the only meaningful conflict that Indians had to pay attention to. If you want to understand, as Rushdie does want to understand, what has happened to his country since independence. So just to say that more simply, he chooses this moment to say it's not just between the British and the Indians, it's also between Hindus and Muslims. It's very strange that he should say that in the middle of a description of a massacre, which has nothing to do with Muslims, immediately nothing to do with Hindus and Muslims. To say that the grandfather in Rushdie, who focuses the reader's view, survives the massacre, is not quite the same thing as saying, and this is a second reason why prolepsis seems to get attached to atrocity, that by looking beyond atrocity, and these examples do exactly that, prolepsis looks away from atrocity. It does look away from atrocity, but not just in order to spare our feelings, to cushion the impact of the violence so that it doesn't hurt as much. Often it does so, as in Rushdie, to remind us of something else of ethical and political importance that we might otherwise miss if we looked only, as we are so tempted to, at those who are shooting and those who are dying. There's also something else it does on the formal and visceral level that I'm struggling to try to understand. Readers invest their feelings in characters. Perhaps invest is a crude and misleading metaphor, but I think you know what I mean. Our feelings are not unlimited. We cannot care equally about all the characters in a narrative. If some characters are major, as we say, meaning that we care more about them, then other characters will be minor, as we say, meaning we will care less about them. And this economics of readerly emotion or identification reaches a crucial point when we have reason to fear that the character may die. In other words, that we will be emotionally distressed by that death, that to put it coldly, we may lose our emotional investment. From this perspective, prolepsis seems to reassure the reader at a frightening moment. It's not your fate to lose here and now the emotion you have invested in this character. Or perhaps it's even cruder, it's not your fate to die here yourself, in the sense that that character's death would feel like your own death. This is not you. If the story survives, then in a sense you survive. The question then is how to estimate my losses as a reader, how to calculate the value of the threat I've just endured, a threat to my survival. I don't know how to name that readerly calculus, but it seems a step forward merely to indicate that there is one there to be named. I'm going to skip that last sentence. Sorry if that confuses you. The economics of reader affect is all the more interesting if we assume that the intended readers are on the side of the people committing the atrocity. And again, this is a principle that I'm particularly interested in myself as part of this examination of national self-critique. Consider Tolstoy's Haji Murat. No. Did I skip this? Well, okay. Maybe I didn't give you all the passages. Yes, I didn't give you this one, I think. So this is about the conquest of Chechnya. We see the armies burning of an indigenous village through the eyes of a Russian soldier. The mind of the Russian soldier is elsewhere, preoccupied with a theme that could not be more conventional for people like him, money that he has lost playing cards. For him, it's an unremarkable day, so the reader sees nothing remarkable. I quote, "War presented itself to him only in the sense that he subjected himself to danger, the possibility of death, and in so doing earned both decorations and the respect both of his comrades here and his friends in Russia. The mountaineers, that is the Chechens, presented themselves to him only as skilled horsemen against whom one had to defend oneself. Given this failure of imagination on the Russian side, the narrator must step in and somewhat intrusively make a connection on the next page that no one within the world of the novel is there to make. The people who are living this, the Russians that is, are not interested. The village sacked in the raid was the very one in which Haji Murat had spent the night before he went over to the Russians. On returning to his village, Sado, this is the man at whose house we've seen Haji Murat greeted hospitably in the novel's first scene, despite the extreme danger the host is in, found his hut ruined, the roof had fallen in, the door and pillars of the gallery had been burnt, and the interior had been defiled. His son, the handsome boy with the shining eyes, who had looked at Haji Murat in rapture, was carried dead to the mosque on a horse covered with a felt cloak. He had been bayoneted in the back. It is only thanks to the narrator's intrusiveness that the death of this child, and we have spent some time with this child earlier in the novella, so this hurts more than the narrator is telling us. That the death of this child can interrupt the regular flow of ordinary novelistic time, concerned as it is with gambling debts and the respect of comrades, the furniture in the house, the piece of cloth on the horse. All these things are presented as equal. The reader will feel indignant that the narrative does not linger longer. In fact, the sentence about the boy bayoneted in the back does not even end the paragraph. There's no pause. I made my voice pause so as to emphasize the fact that in Tolstoy there is no pause. It is again thanks to the narrator's intrusiveness that the novel does not stop with this atrocity and all it stands for, but manages, however, tentatively to go forward. And though it goes forward only in order to end with the hero's death, it does so in a way that emphasizes a history of survival, a history that cannot be stopped even by atrocity. Haji Murat, like Aureliano Buendia, is another rebel against the established order. On what will turn out to be the day of his death, he too suddenly remembers his childhood. And though Buendia does not die as foretold in the famous first sentence, and Haji Murat does, that sentence's way of making free with time also has an echo in Haji Murat's death scene. He has been shot several times and has fallen. I should really have given you this passage, but I forgot. He did not move, but could still feel. When Haji Aga, the first to run up to him, struck him on the head with a large dagger, it seemed to him that he was being hit on the head with a hammer, and he could not understand who was doing it and why. This was his last consciousness of a connection with his body. He no longer felt anymore, and his enemies trampled and cut something that no longer had anything in common with him. These are famous sentences. It is from his perspective that his head is merely something. He still possesses perspective, possesses feeling, the way these sentences are written, even after we are told that he has ceased to feel. So it's a paradox. He's feeling, and we're told that he's not feeling. In the same way, the clause, he no longer felt anymore, keeps Haji Murat alive as a grammatical subject, even after he, like his people, has been decapitated. Allegorically, and allegory is the mode in which Tolstoy both begins and ends this novella, the narrative keeps alive both its hero and the indigenous people of the Caucasus, whom he represented, keeps them alive beyond the atrocities they suffered and beyond their conquest. At least since Homer, and perhaps since Gilgamesh, prolepsis has looked forward to the death of an individual character. That's still what it's doing in many contemporary novels. This is a funny example. There are many examples. I'm going to cut this paragraph, however, so enjoy it if you like, but I would prefer not to keep you here any longer than I absolutely have to. I think of this as looking forward to the end of a life so as to be able to evaluate the life as a whole. In other words, prolepsis, referring to the hero's death, as offering life as a totality that is otherwise unavailable. The ability to think of a life as a whole is not something that we ordinarily have access to. At any rate, this view of prolepsis may help explain how you get from prolepsis as representation of the death of a single character to the way prolepsis gathers around atrocities or large-scale man-made death. The social totality is a perhaps non-existent whole to which you are not quite certain you belong. A disaster is needed, one might say, in order to make you experience both the belonging to a larger whole and the uncertainty that you belong to the larger whole. And it has to be a disaster in the future which does not appeal to your human sympathy, but rather to your readerly self-interest. It leaves you not knowing how much of your emotional investment as a reader, investment in the lives of others, you are in danger of losing if they're murdered. The historian Hayden White has argued that all narrative moralizes, that we only recognize narrative resolution or closure. In other words, that a narrative has come to an end, that it is a narrative, that it forms a whole, because it corresponds in some way to what our society teaches us is just or unjust. This offers a way of considering the characteristic sentences by which prolepsis helps novelists give form to atrocity. Consider, for example, the Holocaust, you know what that is, as presented in Jenny Erpenbeck's novel Visitation. 2 months after Arthur and Hermione, so you understand the jump forward again, this is like 2 months later. 2 months after Arthur and Hermione get into the gas truck in Kulmhof, outside of Lodz, after Arthur's eyes pop out of their sockets as he asphyxiates, and Hermione in her death throes defecates on the feet of a woman she's never seen before. All their assets, together with the assets remaining in Germany that belong to their son Ludwig, who has emigrated, are seized. It's one sentence. Perhaps this is a way of getting from injustice of an easily imagined kind, the seizure of assets, to injustice that is almost unimaginable, what happens when the older people are gassed in the gas truck. The violent anti-Islamic coup in Orhan Pamuk's novel Snow is announced by a crescendo of prolepses. These are just 2 of them. There was a tense silence, during which Necip raised his beautiful eyes, one of which in 2 hours and 3 minutes would be shattered by a bullet. 30 pages later, his eyes opened wide, one of them to be shattered 26 minutes later, along with his brain. It is sometimes said that prolepsis serves to eliminate suspense. Applied to minor characters like Necip, this cannot be its purpose. For minor characters, there was never any suspense to begin with. If anything, being told in advance what will befall minor characters sometime later adds suspense, adds to them a story of their own, an interesting uncertainty. One might say that it generates readerly feeling or concern with regard to characters who would not otherwise receive such concern. And it does so, I repeat, in the face of atrocity. Another example. This is from Murakami's Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. How many people have read the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle? I don't believe you. You don't read Murakami?
His earlier works we have.
Sorry?
Earlier works.
But not Wind-Up Bird. Oh, okay,
Not
fine. I will find out afterwards what it is you do read. So this is the execution of Chinese prisoners by the Japanese army in Manchuria. Again, focused on a doomed minor character. Have you ever played baseball? The lieutenant asked the young soldier, the one who would eventually have his skull split open with a shovel by a Soviet guard in a mine near Irkutsk. The soldier whose death is here foretold smashes the Chinese prisoner's head with a baseball bat, as he is ordered, and then we get more future deaths. One of them is explicit retribution for the war crime. After they were disarmed by the Soviets, the young paymaster lieutenant would be handed over to the Chinese and hanged for his responsibility in these executions. Some, and perhaps all, of these foretold deaths leap out of narrative sequence in order to suggest that within that sequence, where atrocity is concerned, or perhaps more generally, justice does not yet exist. It seems worth speculating that ethical difficulty in assigning responsibility in these executions has something to do with the expanded geography of the contemporary, the fact that the moral authority of the nation is inadequate to judge atrocity because it is implicated in the atrocity, whether by omission or by commission, and the fact that it has yet to be replaced or supplemented by a more adequate supranational one. That is really the most interesting thought that I had in writing this paper. I'm sorry, I didn't write this. And it's something that I would really like to try to understand better. That is the idea that the form of novels reflects our sense of how likely justice is in particular cases, which in turn reflects the jurisdiction of the political units to which we belong. So if there are certain kinds of things that we do not believe the nation that we live in would punish or would even see as something bad, as in cases where our country commits atrocities against the inhabitants of another country, you need prolepsis to jump forward to a justice that you know that your own nation would never provide. Does that make sense? Anyway, I'm a little vague about that, but it seems to me that there is something interesting there about the transnational character of narrative. Murakami is someone who thinks he's read in Korea. Obviously not enough, right? He knows that he has read outside his own country and is thinking of that, I think, when he does this atrocity description. Anyway, back to the text. Although actually not entirely back to the text. I cut some stuff. The idea of prolepsis as marking the site of an absent justice, absent because of an uncertainty about the geographical scale of the relevant moral community or moral authority, seems linked to the tendency of prolepsis to collect around minor characters who are facing atrocity. I'm going to skip some sentences. My provisional conclusion here is that atrocity prolepses are a kind of poetic intensification of the uncertainty of major and minor, rescuing us from fatal confrontation with the forces with which it also threatens us, forces that seem to come from outside our world, while also reminding us that the emotional losses with which we are threatened are only what our belonging to the society of victims would entail or does entail. Okay, so I'm now going to go off into more novels that probably nobody, well, one of them I know you don't know, and the other one I'm almost certain you don't know. And at this point, I can be stopped at any point. I could stop now, actually.
No, you can go on.
I have to go on. I must go on.
If you wish, you can
All
go
right.
on for 10 or even 15
10,
minutes.
okay.
You have-
I'll see if I can cut a bit as I go along. Okay, this is the quotation from Haji Murad, which I put in the wrong order. Read it quick? No, you don't have time to read it. Bye.
I think you read as we went along.
Oh, yeah, it's true. So up to now I've been talking about the prolepsis atrocity connection. Now I'm going to stop talking about that and simply compare, I hope briefly, one very famous atrocity description, which I've referred to already, and another less famous one. The famous one being Garcia Marquez and his description of the massacre of the striking banana plantation workers. The less famous one from the novel G, 1972, which won the Booker Prize by the art critic, art historian, television personality, and novelist John Berger. Has anyone heard of John Berger? So this is now about Garcia Marquez. Up to the moment when the order to fire is given, people in Marquez's crowd show no evidence of believing that they might be shot. At that time, it all seemed more like a jubilant fair than a waiting crowd. Ordered to disperse, they jeer their defiance and do not move. Then the machine guns open fire. It all seems unreal. There are the first casualties. We get the point of view of a child rescued by José Arcadio Segundo. This is the line I've already read. Many years later, that child would still tell, in spite of people thinking he was a crazy old man, how José Arcadio Segundo had lifted him over his head and hauled him almost in the air, as if floating on the terror of the crowd toward a nearby street. So this is the finale of the description. Several voices shouted at the same time, "Get down, get down." The people in front had already done so, swept down by the wave of bullets. The survivors, instead of getting down, tried to go back to the small square, and the panic became a dragon's tail as one compact wave ran against another, which was moving in the opposite direction, toward the other dragon's tail in the street across the way, where the machine guns were also firing without cease. They were penned in, swirling about in a gigantic whirlwind that little by little was being reduced to its epicenter, as the edges were systematically being cut off all around like an onion, being peeled by the insatiable and methodical shears of the machine guns. José Arcadio Segundo put the child up there at the moment he fell with his face bathed in blood, before the colossal troop wiped out the empty space, the kneeling woman, the light of the high drought-ridden city, and the whorish world where Ursula Iguaran had sold so many little candy animals. Needless to say, this is a politically powerful passage, and justly celebrated as such, but striking details do something other than awaken concern. For example, there is the dark pun on "get down," had already done so. The prolepsis, many years later, that detaches us from the present. Many years later, reassuringly identifies our point of view with that of the survivor. It tells us there was a survivor, the child who must survive in order to testify and be thought years later a crazy old man. There is a similar detachment in the conspicuous metaphors, the dragon's tail, the whirlwind, and the onion. All of these metaphors are visible only from a perspective above and outside the massacre. The passage does not look at the massacre through the eyes of the crowd itself. To see what is happening as a whole, the narrator's perspective withdraws to a high place where metaphors like onion and dragon's tail make visual sense. On reflection, this seems suspiciously like the point of view of those who are doing the shooting, also from a high place. From the moment when the shooting begins, the crowd becomes a collection of victims and victims to be. No one manifests any intention except to escape. The implication is, this is my interpretation beginning, that they have an ordinary life to which they can escape, a destination, arrival at which would constitute escape. I notice this only because such a destination is lacking in the massacre scene in G. In G, correspondingly, those who expose themselves to the army's guns seem to know exactly what they're doing, with the exception of, with one exception, the child and the Roman girl, but you don't know the book, so why am I mentioning them? They do not try to escape. What does Garcia Marquez think of the whorish world that is wiped out, the Spanish is the same as erased, by the machine guns? The word whorish is not affectionate, although those female characters in the novel to whom it might normally be applied have in fact been distinctly and entirely positive figures for this novel. So what is going on? A first hypothesis would be that atrocity comes from outside this world. In other words, that there is no atrocity at the core of this world. As the crowd sees it, in spite of their organizing against the banana company, the ordinary life that they led before the banana company came was a good life. No complaint is registered against small-scale enterprise. I skipped that. It is only the arrival of the banana company that has made a real difference. Unfortunately, the hypothesis that the responsibility of the banana company is all we need to know, politically speaking, is overtaken by events. You might say falsified. The banana company is now going to leave after this massacre, and yet things in Macondo will get even worse. At no point are the people of Macondo ready to make any changes in their world, or even to recognize that such changes are necessary. This is why I think that Garcia Marquez calls their world whorish. And it's why at the end of the novel, this will not make any sense to you because you haven't read it, but it's actually quite an interesting interpretation, I think. It's why at the end of the novel, he feels that he himself has to abolish this whorish world, as he abolishes the Buendia family itself. And it's why he does so by erasing it in another whirlwind. Those are words that show up again on the last page of the novel. Using exactly the same words about what he is doing as an author that he has used for the machine guns in the massacre scene. The people of Macondo, in love with the beautiful perfections of their ordinary lives, do not realize that the state of their world is intolerable. As John Berger puts it, the full measure of the truth about their conditions was unknown even by those who suffered it. They are unmotivated to make a revolution, and that is why the revolutionary Garcia Marquez has to realize the world's intolerability for them. Hence the strange rhyme between the massacre scene and the novel's final paragraph. Garcia Marquez has to condemn and erase the whorish world where Ursula sold her little candy animals because the people in the square do not condemn it. It's an exemplary gesture of modernist exasperation, a flinging away of the crooked timber of humanity out of which nothing revolutionary can seemingly be made. In Garcia Marquez, the people are tricked into appearing in the square where they will be massacred. It's a trap. They do not know the truth about their situation. In Berger's G, it is the people who create the confrontation with the army. For your information, I don't know if this matters, it's 1898, it's Milan, there are strikes, and the army shoots people. This also is a historical fact. No deception or hypocrisy is involved. What they see is what they get. As in Garcia Marquez, some of the description comes through the viewpoint of a child, the 11-year-old G. Again, it's this child whose escape and survival will offer the massacre scene a kind of minimally positive counterplot. But in this case, no one else is trying to escape. And because the crowd has chosen to be there and to stay there and to look straight ahead into the guns, the narrative viewpoint does not have to withdraw from them or to rise above them in order to make sense of the event. The narrative looks through their eyes, and what it sees is the intolerability of ordinary life. The crowd see the city around them with different eyes. They have stopped the factories producing, forced the shops to shut, halted the traffic, occupied the streets. It is they who have built the city and they who maintain it. They are discovering their own creativity. They are rejecting all that they habitually and despite themselves accept. This is the key sentence, and I'm going to repeat it. They are rejecting all that they habitually and despite themselves accept. This is the novel's declaration that the world as it is, however imbued with their creativity, is intolerable. Berger makes the reasons for their discontent go deep into ordinary life. Before the confrontation in the streets, the people strike the first blow, attacking tax registers. Why? I quote, "The tax on flour is over 50%, on sugar, 300%, on meat and milk, 20%. Salt is so highly taxed that many peasants never taste it. Meanwhile, it is an offense against the excise for those who live by the coast to draw salt water from the sea. Guards have shot at women coming down to the beaches with buckets. It is safest at night. Phosphorescent drops form for a moment along the rim of the bucket in whose illegal water she will cook tomorrow's pasta." The sentence, "it is safest at night," places the narrative inside the point of view of women who are already shot at in their ordinary lives, before they are shot at again on the barricades. The sentence, "phosphorescent drops form for a moment along the rim of the bucket," individualizes this point of view, preparing for the she of "she will cook," and credits it with a refined aesthetic sensibility. It's the rest of the truth about ordinary life. These are not merely working-class women who cannot afford the salt they want for their cooking. They are also women who observe and appreciate the beauty of phosphorescence on the rim of a bucket. That phosphorescence is rightfully theirs. Ordinary life is intolerable if you are not allowed to take salt water out of the sea. What makes it absolutely intolerable is that the salt water is also beautiful, and that the beauty too is fenced off by men with guns. Because the men with guns are there protecting the sea and its salt, there is no ordinary life to escape back to. Berger sees the demonstration of the strikers as coming out of the very nature of the life they live, not from an interruption of their life, like the interruption caused by the banana company in Garcia Marquez. In G, ordinary life is not full as it is in 100 Years of Solitude. Life is constitutively lacking and unsatisfactory. This, of course, gives a different meaning to the risk of losing one's life. Atrocity is most often seen as terrible but exceptional. Now I'm talking about what we generally think. To liberal common sense, atrocity is an exception to the ordinary functioning of civil order, an exception that proves the rule of that order, that the order does not normally generate extreme, collective, indiscriminate cruelty. The atrocity confirms the virtues of the normal social order by representing everything that order is not. This understanding is so strong that even Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is no liberal, falls into it, rescuing his revolutionary hopes only at the end of the novel, and only by a gesture of social erasure that, as I said, is unsettlingly congruent with the atrocity itself. It is this vision of atrocity that I would like to credit John Berger with transcending. His alternative is to see atrocity as unexceptional, as merely crystallizing or making visible that which is already or generally the case. In G, the people themselves have decided that ordinary life is not worth living. They do not require a gesture of radical modernist estrangement on the part of their author, because they are themselves modernists dedicated to estrangement from a world that deserves nothing else. To give a twist to Raymond Williams' famous formula that culture is ordinary, for Berger, atrocity is ordinary. And I am going to skip the last paragraph because I think that's enough. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bruce Robbins, for that very profound meditations on these atrocities that are being depicted by this literature. I, as a student of literature, once read from Adorno that literature after Holocaust is impossible, and yet you have these writers who are describing persistently about their memories of atrocities. And Professor Robbins is very acutely detect some very interesting sign, if you will, the prolepsis, by which what is impossible becomes possible. So he's, I guess, in the domain of possibility, how interestingly these writers would use the prolepsis to describe this acts of violence that traumatize people, both at an individual and collective level. Do you have any questions about his observation? Any comments? Anything that you'd like?
Did it make any sense at all? This would be a good time to, I will go home and cry. So if you could nod a little bit, it made some sense.
Made a lot of. It's not really a comment. It's just something I thought about as I was reading along and following your thinking. So if it touches any nerve
If
with
it
you,
can stop
you
me
can
from
comment on
crying, that
Right.
would be good.
But isn't sort of any historical novel, or actually I was thinking about historical documentaries, isn't it in a sense both analeptic and proleptic at the same time, just by its very constitution? Like, we know what happened, we have the sort of thesis or the result presented to us beforehand, and then it sort of takes us through the details in another repeat of that cycle in a sense.
Probably in the largest sense, that's true. And maybe it's even important. I think that there's something more specific here, that there's something weird about a kind of jumping away from the directness of the representation, right? Jumping forward and then backward. I mean, that on some level there's a jump forward and backward in any treatment of history. I'm sure that's true. But yeah, there seems to be something stylistically interesting about these examples. I'm sure it's not true that there are many examples of which it's not true. But there are enough for which it is true that I thought, okay, I can get credit for some analysis here that,
No, it's interesting.
I mean, I'm not sure, since you mentioned documentary, whether there would be an analog in the visual medium, because this is very, very much something that's done with words, right? It's not, it wouldn't be the same, I think, in film, for example.
Well, what I was thinking of as you were talking about the Murakami passage and reading through that, I was thinking, sort of, I saw a documentary on Japanese soldiers who were marooned in Southeast Asian islands in the Pacific and, sort of like left to die, and that was sort of a documentary of that atrocity in its way. But sort of everything is framed in the documentary, and it seems to me, again, like I'm not quite sure how many connections can be drawn, that everything is sort of framed with the understanding by the viewer or the reader or whatever that yes, these people are going to die, that this is their fate. But that's not necessarily true in what we take as a fictional novel, so the prolepsis in the novel itself may be I don't know, doing some kind of similar framing function or something. Perhaps even a realist function in a sense of saying that this is something that will happen, that this is something you can believe.
Right. If you're not going to ask me questions, I'm going to ask you questions. So I realize it's not your, am I allowed to do that?
Yes, but can I also ask a question?
I take that as a no. All right.
I mean, you gave us many different examples from different novels and stories, and these proleptic acts of prolepsis, that's a stylistic act, correct me if I'm wrong, but they seem to be differently motivated in different cases. Are you trying to say that, so with these different motivations and motive, you're trying to sort of give us the collection of different meanings and try to sort of find a denomination of the different meanings. In some case, for example, this proleptic, the act of jumping forward away from that act of the violent, traumatic violence is a place of absence of justice. So this leap into the future would be an utopian act in the sense that they would hope for a presence of justice that will organize our life in everyday patterns. So that's a utopian act. But in last John Burgess' G, which I haven't read, I'm sorry.
No one
For
has
some
read
reason,
it.
Today I feel very sorry for not
It
reading.
won the
some of
Booker
the
Prize,
books.
right? It was a big thing at the time.
That this you're making this case that these atrocities are very commonplace. But there is no way out of that. If everything is atrocious, then there seems to be no necessity of jumping forward to hope for a version of society as alternative to this wreckage of violence.
Yeah, that's a great point. I will refuse to be humiliated by it. What I take that as suggesting is that there's a connection between the first part of my paper and the second part of my paper, which I had not realized.
Yes, there are.
And that's really, really useful. Now, the fact of it is that there's more also about the Garcia Marquez and Berger, in which I'm not being evasive here, but I actually thought to myself, do I really believe that atrocity is ordinary? In the sense that there really is no place you can go that is not atrocity. And I said to myself, no, you don't believe that. So it seems to me that the argument has got to go somewhere other than where I stopped. And in fact, it kind of does in John Berger's career, which I was writing about from another perspective, because this is, to me, quite interesting, but maybe not to you. After writing this novel, G, Berger started living in a peasant village in the mountains in France and writing about the lives of peasants. And when I say a peasant village, I mean a very primitive village where there was no running water and there were no toilets, and he sort of shoveled his own shit, if I may say. And he is 88 years old and he is still living in that village. This is many years have gone by. Now, the problematic of peasant life, the way he writes about it, is a problematic not of revolution, but of survival. The peasants that he writes about, and has written many books about them, are not interested in making revolutions. They're interested in the survival of their way of life, which is to say that he thinks, clearly he thinks, that this is an ordinary way of life that is not atrocity, that the atrocity here would be the erasure of their way of life in villages, taking care of animals, growing their own food, and so on and so forth. So to the extent that what he's defending is survival, he himself disagrees with what I make him say here, but what I think he actually was saying here. So this is to say that I already was, in a way, getting on your wavelength. And I clearly have mixed feelings about this. In fact, some of you here were listening to Sue Ellen Case at the Cosmopolitanism conference, or no? I thought. Anyway, it seemed to me that her talk was making a version of the case that ordinary life is atrocity. Anyway, this won't mean that, yeah?
Okay, I have a question. I happen to be Sue Ellen Casey's discussant, and but you left in the middle of.
I did.
Yeah.
I was told I had to, right? I was.
All right, but there's one. I asked her a question, but I didn't really get an answer from her. So, may I pose the same question here? Because I missed.
I didn't give her talk.
No, but it's about atrocity, and even though I missed most part of your presentation, it still, I think, have some relationship, because my question was the atrocity of 9/11, the atrocity in reality, and the atrocity depicted in Sarah Kane's Blasted. Okay, and in order to textualize those two different ontological or different levels of atrocity, in terms of Peng Xia's today's talking about the more teleological direction of world literature. So I wonder, how do you give some meaning? Just not commonsensical literature is something more higher level of reflection than about reality. But how do you give the meaning or interpret that kind of representational distance created by literature? Okay, actually affect our way to see the atrocity in life. If it just say, atrocity is ordinary, and this is the reality we are living, and is that it? I mean, why do you think Sarah Kane actually staged that kind of atrocity on the stage, rather than just, this is the reality? Do you see any kind of teleological direction or yarning that runs through all these literature that depicts atrocity as detailed as this much? So where are we going to with this?
Yeah, thank you. That's really an excellent question. I'm sorry that I wasn't there to hear you ask her, or for that matter, to find out how she answered, so that I might have a better idea of how I should answer. So, first of all, the analogy that I see between her talk and what I was saying at the end of my talk can be focused on what she said about the Sarah Kane play Blasted. Now, you'll correct me if you think this is unfair. It seemed to me that Sarah Kane's play Blasted, as she was reading it, was saying that male brutality against women makes everyday life an atrocity for women. As if the ordinary life as lived by men and women with each other, with men having more power and women having less power, and men imposing themselves on women, made life into a perpetual war zone. So that the war zone that she's talking about is the war zone in particular of the sexes. So that there is no peace between the sexes. There's war, either whether we recognize the war or not, it's war all the time. And you need actual soldiers and rapists and so on in order for, literature needs those things, in order to make men and women realize that their everyday holding hands and having breakfast and so on, all of that is like war. Now, maybe it's because I'm a guy, I tend to resist this idea, and not only a guy, but I cook for my children. I'd leave it at that. Just say, in fact, I think that there has been some progress away from the gender relations that used to pertain 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I am on Peng Che's side of the idea of progress as exemplified by the relations between the sexes, not in every domain, but in that domain, it seems to me, things have changed and have changed for the better. You can throw things at me if you want, but this is how I see things. So I'm on his side on that. Now, to try to answer your question about literature, it does seem to me that literature has a kind of vested interest in exaggerating that which is most contrary to common sense. That is, if literature wants to appear to be something more than entertainment, and serious writers do want to think of themselves as doing more than entertaining, then often the vision that they will offer will be something at a distance from common sense, right? And the idea that ordinary relations, let's say between the sexes, are really a form of war with a, much more powerful side and a much less powerful side, and so on and so forth. That I can understand why a playwright would be drawn to, that somewhat more, it's that heightened vision. Now, I don't know whether that answers your question, and not only that, but I'm obviously also drawn myself. I have not, thank God, seen with my own eyes Atrocity. So I can't say that a realistic literary representation of life, such as I've seen it, should have atrocity in it, right? My life has not had atrocity in it that I can see. But of course, historically, we know that these things are part of the lives that we live, or they are kind of foundations in some way upon which the life that we live has been built. So maybe we also want literature to remind us of those things that we don't see every day taking the bus, but that we know are in some way constitutive of the lives that we live, or our parents' lives, or our grandparents' lives. We need to be reminded of the things we don't see with our own eyes.
Thank you. Yeah. Answered my question in a very significant way, but
Well.
not entirely. But
I also walked in late, so I wasn't able to hear the whole presentation, but over the past 3 hours, I've heard 3 different depictions of men's eyeballs being sucked out or exploded. Is this mere coincidence?
Good.
It wasn't Sue Ellen's Blasted, it wasn't the one that you were reading when we walked in, and then of course Oedipus. But the very definition of obscene, and I'm not a drama specialist, but obscene is off the scene, not to be represented. So I think your question has something to do with, is it, why not to be represented? Is it a prescription? Is it an ethical category, do you think? What is this about?
is it a question for me?
I think it's a question you were trying to ask. That ordinarily this is the kind of thing that we don't see represented.
Well, it may be, obviously this is part of literary history, that the standards for representation have changed a lot. You probably know, because of the stuff that you work on, the concept of classical attenuation. In the 17th century, for example, in classical French drama, there were acts of violence, really terrible violence, that are referred to, but they happen off stage. And it's Leo Spitzer who had this phrase, classical attenuation. That is, in the classical drama, these things can be referred to, but they should never be shown on stage. Whereas, in someone like Shakespeare, that's not true, right? You get some strong stuff on stage. I don't know whether I can synthesize, the different the standards in different times and places for what should be represented directly and what should be only referred to but not represented directly. Which, yeah.
But either words or images, they are still represented, right? But that's not the real atrocity, the reality, just like the 9/11. What I'm very much intrigued and very much sorry, and so disturbed by, I don't know if you know this this guy, the German avant-garde artist called Heinz Stockhausen, who had this very controversial comment about 9/11, quote, "the world's greatest work of art."
Oh yes,
unquote.
of course.
You know that, right? So I really wonder, what's the difference? What makes this kind of representational distance can help us to see world differently for better, cosmopolitan, utopian vision. Otherwise, if we cannot compete with, for example, theatrical performance cannot compete with 9/11 in terms of the impact, visceral, right, kind of things, right? And what do you think of that kind of notion, and how can we defend literature, which creates not necessarily the reality, but this kind of second reality, which is supposed to be constantly interact and intersect and permeate into the first reality? What makes literature distinctive and viable and still matters, right? In this time of real atrocity is
Yeah.
everywhere.
That's very, very hard. It's also hard for me to be objective about that because I live in the neighborhood of the World Trade Center. And I watched some of that happen from my roof after I found out in between the time when the first plane hit and I mean I have written something about the representations of 9/11 in American fiction, and I thought about that, and on the whole, I'll say I was kind of disappointed in the way the American novel has dealt with 9/11. That's not really an answer to your question. I could also talk about the things that I was moved by in the days and weeks and months after that. I was not obsessed with, in fact, I would say that maybe this is relevant to the classical attenuation question, pictures of the people who jumped from the buildings or phone conversations that they, or conversations or recordings that they left on answering machines. I didn't want to know that. That was a bit too much for me. I was in tears probably 10 times a day during that period, and it would be things like seeing firemen walk by all covered with sweat and dirt. That would just, I would become a little ball of, anyway. But it seemed to me, as I say, that literature in large part failed, partly because the American novel did something that the American novel does over and over again, which is in the presence of public collective catastrophe, it tells a story in which one should retreat to one's private domestic life. All good things are to be found in privacy, in the intimacy of one's family, and the world outside is chaotic. You will never make any sense out of it. Stay away from it. Retreat into the family. That, it seems to me, over and over and over again, we got that moral, even from very good artists. And I think, well, I'm going to give away some of my own political predispositions here, but that was failing the public responsibility to explain why the United States was the target of that attack, something which had to do with decades and decades of American foreign policy. And I feel like I can say that, and I have to say it, even though it doesn't justify killing 3,000 people. You don't understand it at all if you're not willing to talk about those things. And most American writers were not interested. Granted that when someone like Susan Sontag, who was a kind of hero at that period, merely tried to say, and this is a very small thing, again, you people were too young to have experienced any of this, but so President Bush talked about the cowards in those planes. The people in the planes were cowards. The hijackers were cowards. And Sontag said, whatever else you want to say about them, they're not cowards, right? I mean, they were willing to die for what they believed in. That doesn't make them cowards. And people almost pulled her up in pieces. They wanted her dead for having said something which is merely minimal rationality. Let's use the word coward, you know, so that its meaning continues to function. They were very tough times for anyone who wanted to tell any truth about anything. So I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question at all. I just talked about 9/11.
I will stop here right after this. Okay, so it's interesting because you said American people wanted to go back to their safe domestic space after 9/11. And to me, the Blasted, even though it's a British play, what strikes me in Blasted is not about the war zone between different genders, but it's, to me, what's blasted in that play is the safe boundary between the private space and the public space. Just like you just said, even though I watched TV in my domestic space safe on the day of 9/11, but somehow I couldn't just resist feeling just part of this parallelous globe. It's a negative way to be forced to feel that kind of cosmopolitan, so that was very weird moment. But again, I think relating your comment to Blasted again, to me that play is exactly, wanted to blast that kind of safe boundary between the private hotel room and just the war is blasted and the soldiers suddenly came to that space. So
yeah. I mean, it's very tricky. I'm sorry, you and I can just have a dialogue, obviously, for hours, because we have a lot to say to each other. But, I agree with you that we need to blast the walls down that seem to make the private and the public completely separate from each other. And this is a very important thing to keep in mind when you read literature, because literature sometimes will seem to be a private story, and yet if you look, you can see the public dimensions of that private story. And those will sometimes be the most interesting things or among the most interesting things happening in that apparently private story. So about that, I completely agree, and when I lecture about novels, that's frequently what I talk about. The question is, are there other kinds of connection between the private and the public other than the metaphor of the private as part of a war going on outside? So it's the particular connection between private and public that Sarah Kane and Sue Ellen Case are both interested in that I have some difficulty with. I mean, people build things in common. Sometimes out of their private efforts, they build things together in public, which they can be proud of and pass on to the people who come after them. That's also a connection between the private and the public, but it's a different kind of, that includes making changes in one's private life, which will have repercussions for the way education happens, the way your children will be taught things that you were not taught when you were in elementary school or high school. That will be a public consequence, maybe of things that you have realized in your private lives. Anyway, just to say that the public-private connection can go in more than one direction.
Any thoughts that you'd like to offer as we are reaching the end of the session? You want to say something?
My topic was war poetry. My topic was war poetry, and you talk about that public space, sphere, or private things. So in that kind of literature, I totally agree with you because we have talked about that kind of repercussion from the public areas and some kind of bit of the private space or private things. So yeah, just brief comments. So that has been discussed a lot, problematically, but the kind of blurry conditions of the two things that we believe that we have constructed the private things kind of separate from the public things, but in world literature, the kind of the topic has been kind of established. So I want to say I agree with you about that point. That's it.
Thanks. Can I ask this? I know I'm not going to get any of the students to say anything. There's no way. But so how has Korean literature represented, you're going to say you've never read any Korean literature, the period of the Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945? Any atrocities?
Comes in many different responses from.
You're not going to let them say anything.
Oh,
I can see.
yes, students, Korean students are notoriously shy in public. Then in private, pester you with all these difficult
I see.
questions.
All right, fine.
That's-
I don't want to torture you.
Thank you very much, Professor Robbins. It was remarkable to see the relationship between Professor Robbins and how he encaptivates the audience. 45 minutes and then beyond that time is really great. That I can see how people are enthralled by an idea and thoughts are very difficult to wrestle with, and yet literature has certain responsibility, if you will, of recording these atrocious acts that paints our remembrance of history, human history. So thank you very much for that, Professor Robbins, for starting this great conversation, which I'm sure will go on even without him here. That we will talk about this in seminars and whatnot. And my students, for example, when we meet Tuesday, we'll talk about this, okay? Thank you very much for this, and I hope this will become a beginning of a great relationship between Professor Robbins and friends here at Ehwa, and thank you very much.